Thank you very much for having me, for inviting me, and for introducing me. It is a great honor for me to be here, as it happens for me. This month, we celebrate the 100th anniversary of birth of my preferred writer, Stanisław Lem. So I continue referring to him and to his writings whenever I address the public. And if we speak about Stanisław Lem in present day, next to his unquestionable merits, one of the things to be remembered is that he was one of the first men in Poland and in the world that sent warning about potential threats arising out of the internet. And his first warning signals came from 1995, so as early as possible. That's where we started using the internet. Beforehand, we had World Wide Web, or even not a global web. There were initial initiatives not first available to an average bread eater, and beforehand you had some academic credentials to use some intranets or proto-internets, and then it got popularized, and those warnings and this premonition that Stanisław Lem had was ignored. He was one of the first skeptics, and now I feel guilty because I used to be a young journalist, but I engaged in polemics with Stanisław Lem 20-ish years ago. This was so silly of me, because time would tell that Stanisław Lem was 100% correct, sending those warning signals into the world. And I was wrong. I was completely wrong. Why would my generation, and I must say my generation, we ourselves, so it is not only my colleagues, but also myself. I put the blame on me as well. Why back then?
Więc jesteśmy kolejnym pokoleniem, które będzie pisało jakieś wspomnienia pod tytułem Byliśmy głupi.
We were so silly, because with the benefit of hindsight, why do we say that we were so silly? Why were we not able to identify so obvious threats and risks? But if you remember this internet of the elites with some special credentials that you needed in order to be in the net, and if you did not use internet correctly, then you would be deprived of your authorization and credentials. If the university administrator found you guilty of hate speech or downloading inappropriate content, it was obvious the net administrator would deprive you of your access. And this was the situation back in 1995. And slowly, step by step, we slided into the internet as we have it today. I think that we had a naive misconception that the academic network could be easily copied and pasted on general society, public at large. So Stanisław Lem knew back then that this would not work that simple. An additional byproduct of our infatuation with internet at the academic days was that the first online entrepreneurs, like the founders of Future, Amazon and Google, seemed to us, students of the University of Warsaw, like folks belonging to the same group as we ourselves. They had those T-shirts or hoods like Mark Zuckerberg until present day. So they were very much like someone out of our milieu, and they didn't look like classical CEOs in suits and with ties, and they managed to persuade to us that they are so nice and friendly. They are PhD students of Stanford University, and our doctoral papers translated into boosting enterprises, startups, and we were driven to believe that they were doing something non-for-profit, as if by charity, that they invited banks to finance their venture, but their point was not profit, but giving us better access, and if it was really the case, then we would have logotypes of Google paying for everything, and this conference would be foundations organized by Google, by other online corporations, and we would be proud of having them on board, because we would think that they are just somebody from our scholarly society of academia, of PhDs, and all the tips on the safe use of the internet back in 2011, given by the experts at the conferences as are today's, seemed to the public at large unattainable, undoable, unfeasible. For instance, don't enter any of your data online, be it your ID number or any other data that would serve as your identifiers. Excellent, sounds excellent, but after all, bank sites, travel agencies, Central Statistical Office, they all demand data from us, such as a number of ID. So there was like an answer to this question: if should employer demand from you to reveal your data online, do so. Or if your bank so requires, do so. Put up your data online. And those conferences were more and more pointless, because this was like with the elephant in the room, whose logotype was very much behind you, and that there was no realization that the actual threat to the freedom of speech and liberty are not some dangerous hackers. No. Those great illustrious corporations that have taken over the power over the internet because politicians of my generation, not myself, not my peers, but other people, decision makers, decided not to launch antitrust proceedings 10 years ago, decided to deregulate and facilitate their operations. And of course, we and myself as a journalist may take on some blame on it, because we were also consulted, but I don't know if I was vocal enough. I attended conferences and I provided such pointless advice myself back then. due to Snowden's scandal. And you may like it or lump it, but its direct effect was that everybody realized that corporations will be corporations no matter how hooded their CEOs are. It doesn't really mean that they are philanthropists, disinterested helpers that we believe them to be. So, as a result, we found ourselves in a transition period which poses me in a very awkward position because when we look at journalists who speak about new technologies, when confronted with such experts, people expect some advice and some premonition and some warning. I was silly. I was silly and naive because I expected that the internet would only produce what is good things. And in the transition period, since I have classes on the subject with my students from Collegium Civitas, I told them, and I'm telling them that don't get accustomed to business as usual because things do change and will change before you graduate. I had, for instance, classes and workshops on hate and ban, and in spite of having such classes concerning the subject with traditional students and extramural students, there was what happened all of a sudden was a ban on Twitter issued for President Donald Trump. So a week before, it would be no-go, like the Mission Impossible, and yet it happened. And in 2 or 3 years, it was, as I expected, we would institute strong regulatory mechanisms on the two sides of the Atlantic. The pressure is very strong on both sides of the Atlantic, and neither China nor Russia nor anyone else bought into this idea of rule-free internet. So we should really expect some regulation that will dramatically change the way in which internet is applied. So it is going to have bearing on Facebook contents, but also on our professions. One of the byproducts of the deregulation of the internet that seemed to us to be a realm that would not need any regulation. And it seemed to us that politicians were still analog, they would never be atop of digital revolution, and that it would be best for the professionals to regulate their realms. And the byproduct of such a mindset and attitude is that many of our constitutional and fundamental liberties and values are reduced to the simple EUL, where you agree to what you get because there is no way to disagree. And if you were to be frank, if an average citizen would read the 200 pages of each set of rules that are randomly or defaultly accepted, it would take you more than 1 month of reading. So we buy into something like the terms and conditions for services provided by Google or anyone else, and suddenly it turns out that we have no say because we approve. We gave them like blanket approval of what they do. The banning, the measures like Twitter putting a ban on Trump's publications, no matter what you think of President Trump. But suddenly it turns out that you have no say because you clicked on accept terms and conditions. And for educators, there is additional side effect to be borne in mind. What we have provided for in our Polish education law, this because of the pandemic, invited additional services to be provided by Microsoft, by Google Meet, by Zoom, by other providers, and I'm addressing teachers, lecturers especially. Suddenly, the laws that gave us certain empowerment and laid down certain conditions for us to operate in evaporate because we have terms and conditions of use atop of everything. Never would Microsoft introduce a ban on a teacher on the grounds of presenting undesirable contexts. But theoretically, should there be such an inclination, after clicking I accept terms and conditions, this is quite feasible and possible and imaginable. There has never been such a precedent, but starting from banning Trump's Twitter, we could see very smoothly how the situation could potentially evolve. Because I remember that 2 weeks before the ban, I told my students that this is unlikely to happen. And then having classes with extramural students, I had to revise my paper and presentation completely to account for such a situation, which really happened. So the question is, when the companies that we have given green light in providing educational services will benefit from the green light, where will it blow into our faces? So this starts to be disconcerting. I don't have an idea what to do right now. And certainly neither I myself nor the whole of our state nor will be as important and as vocal as decisions of European Commission, European Parliament, antitrust proceedings, etc., etc. So I'm really sad that this is always omitted when we speak about Polish relations with the European Union. And we have MEPs and experts sitting on this subject in Strasbourg, in Brussels, and our media are quite quiet and tacit about it because there are more interesting topics to get landed on the front pages. So what can we do as parts of various communities? We as educators, what I try to do is to alert students to the dangers and risks entailed by the use of the internet. Don't fall into the same trap that I have fallen into. Don't be guided and led to believe that the internet corporations want your good and what is good for you. Well, we have learned the lesson ourselves. We are more skeptical now and we are more alert. Even if people look nice and fun, this is not a sufficient ground to like them. But children and young people have this naivety, and they believe that the same ideas that were enshrined by Facebook at the launch of the enterprise will continue and be upheld until now. So I'm sorry for this bitterness, but unfortunately, sometimes young people were not yet exposed to the same things that we were exposed to. So the worst thing that we could happen would be to do the same mistake twice, the mistake that we have perpetrated 10 years ago, giving advice that would be not feasible and not doable in practice. Of course, we can say to our kids that the screen time should be limited. All right. And you can come up with ideas like an hour per day, 2 hours per day, and say 2 hours for your tablet, 2 hours for your smartphone. But the pandemic has consigned this to the past. At present, this is like that we never know. We never know whether we are going to have stationary tuition or online tuition. So you cannot really try to introduce restrictions onto the screen time, because in a situation of lockdown, we as parents, we as educators will be doomed to use the internet for teaching purposes. Of course, you can divide the time online, like homework, like education, entertainment. But we will not be able to restrain and control the time online. But we are always dependent on the evolution of pandemic situation and the virus situation. So the most important lesson to be learned from the last 2 decades, well, 2 decades ago, we were too credulous and we thought that internet would flourish without any regulation. And this was a silly idea. It should be stricken out. If you think that it is best to allow them to self-regulate because they are experts, they are professionals, and this is what we hear, what we heard in one of the conferences 10 years ago. If we could turn back time, we would be able to prove that this view was overly naive and easy to compromise. But at present, what I can say is that we cannot condone a situation where terms and conditions of Teams services will predefine the content of the teaching materials used by an individual teacher. So this is another story. This is another story. I have once committed a blunder. I don't want to do it twice. But if you have any ideas or any points, well, I invite you to put up your comments. But to my mind, new regulations is the only way out. We'll need to amend or write new laws. And in the meantime, in the transition period, we should really encourage critical thinking and doubting and in our students, in our pupils. And let me keep my fingers crossed for you in all your efforts in this area. Thank you.
Wojciech, thank you very much. It's been both pleasure and a privilege. I'm so glad I am having someone here physically present on stage. I've had such a deficit of human presence. Yes, we all do during the pandemic, but just a question from the lobby. In 2013, you wrote a book, Internet, Time to Be Afraid. Should we be more afraid or less afraid? Well, if I were to write part 2, I would say time to act. Some legal regulation, some regulatory framework is being prepared, is being drafted, so we should take part of that. Consultations, for example, are an opportunity. The European institutions offer public consultations for such regulations. So finally, the world is trying to correct the mistakes of 20 years ago. Yes, indeed, there is a strategy for safety of children in the digital world, and can we actually ensure a child's right to complete and credible information? No, unfortunately, this all boils down to clicking a yes when you accept the rules of service, the end user rules. So we have less and less possibilities of control over this, but we should fight against it, and we have already begun that fight as a humanity. Well, thank you about this call for action, and now we shall start a debate. We will continue discussing the results of the pandemic. However, we will focus on school. Post-pandemic school, what it is and what it could be. Maybe we find some potential that we were not aware about. Szymon Wojciech will be the moderator from Empowering the Children Foundation, and he will introduce our panelists.